Hello, everybody. My name is Ana Coelho. I am a PhD student at the University of Aveiro in Portugal, and I am thrilled to be here today with an example of biodiversity and human interaction, in particular to talk about how are migratory shorebirds influenced by the Bijagós culture. So the Bijagós archipelago is located off the coast of West Africa in Guinea-Bissau. It is composed of more than 80 islands, but only a few of them are inhabited by people who have specialized in extracting available natural resources. The islands have a tropical humid climate with palm trees as the main terrestrial habitat and dense mangrove forest and extensive mudflats as the main coastal habitats. These vast areas of mudflats are rich in macroinvertebrates that in turn attract large numbers of migratory shorebirds. These birds breed in the higher latitudes, many of them in the Arctic, where they have plenty of space and food for their chicks, but they are then forced to migrate south to spend the harsh winters. And the Bijagós provide them with the food and the shelter they need to spend the winter, and then to fuel up their migration back into the breeding territories in spring. These inviting conditions make the Bijagós one of the most important wintering sites in the East Atlantic Flyway, with maximum counts of up to 700,000 individuals, representing about 10% of all shorebirds migrating along this flyway. However, many of these populations are currently declining, particularly those that forage on benthic macroinvertebrates. The archipelago is also home to the Bijagós people, known for their rich cultural heritage and animist beliefs, which include specific land management systems. They have rules and sacred areas that aim at protecting the natural world. And although all Bijagós share the same cultural identity, people from some of the least isolated areas are gradually abandoning traditional practices, looking for alternative opportunities in new lifestyles. One of the most important activities of the Bijagós people is shellfish harvesting, which is undertaken only by women and children. Shellfish is one of the major protein sources of their diet, but it is also used for rituals and for ceremonies that are part of their tradition. And more recently, it has started being sold. Here are two of the most harvested species, which are the arch, Senilis senilis, locally known as combe, as I will refer to it from now on. This is a bivalve that buries close to the surface, which makes it very easy to extract, as you can see me here demonstrating. And this is a bivalve that is mostly collected for self-consumption and for selling. The other bivalve is the West African knife, the Bijagós adansoni, also known as lingron. And this is a species that buries deep in the mudflat to escape the predators, and that requires a more advanced technique to extract, which is only mastered by the older women. And this is mostly used for self-consumption and for cultural practices. And shorebirds also feed on these shellfish. So as their densities follow the abundance of their prey, shellfish harvesting could potentially have a considerable impact in shorebird distribution and abundance. So in order to understand the patterns of intertidal bivalve collection by the Bijagós people, we did this preliminary study where we conducted 25 interviews with women shellfishers in 2 islands with different management plans. The island of Formosa is a community marine protected area known for its engagement in the Bijagós culture and in traditional practices that, besides ceremonies, includes a complex land management system with community-imposed rules and sacred areas. And then the island of Bijag, on the other hand, that has a more modern economy. This is the touristic center of the archipelago, where numerous religions have recently arrived, and internet and social media have opened up the world of different cultures and lifestyles, making young generations gradually moving away from the traditional practices, looking for new job opportunities that will give them a higher economical gain. We also looked at the influence of age, family size, and main occupation of the women to explore if that influenced the patterns of bivalve collection. The interviews had qualitative questions where women were asked to rate their agreement with a given sentence following the Likert scale. And they had quantitative questions in order to understand the frequency or amounts collected. We then used the Fisher's independency test to test if the differences were statistically relevant. Here we explore if there's a potential overlap in resource exploitation. And regarding size, both shorebirds and people use these two main shellfish as direct observations and dropping content analysis as shown. However, shorebirds feed on the smaller sized individuals than humans do. So there is no direct overlap in targeted sizes. As for the temporal overlap, here we show a proxy of shorebird abundance over time, highlighting the fueling period. So regarding shellfishing, Formosa has a ban on selling combe in mid-February, which reduces greatly the shellfishing pressure on the mudflats. In Bijag, even though there is no official ban, people do change their main occupation to touch and cashew nut production, which also reduces the visits to the mudflats. So this shows that there's a reduced mudflat usage pattern after February, which is about the same time that shorebirds are preparing to fuel up for the spring migration. So now from the quantitative questions, we could understand more about the variation of collection and economical importance between these islands. So as for the total weight collected per person in one day, we see that for combe in Bijag, it is harvested in higher amounts than in Formosa, even though there's not much data. But as for the lingro, the amounts collected are pretty much similar in both islands. But notice here how combe, which is the easiest shell to collect, is collected in greater amounts than the lingro that requires the more complex technique, which is expected. However, for the economic profit of the combe harvest, it is higher in Formosa than in Bijag, so around 4 euros per person compared to only 2 euros in Bijag. And we think this may be due to an increased demand from mainland merchants that come here directly to buy these bivalves. Now for the lingro, it is quite a different situation because its selling is now forbidden by local laws in the whole archipelago with the goal of sustainably managing this resource. So nobody in Bijag assumed to be earning money from selling lingro. However, in Formosa, there were 4 women that confessed that they still occasionally sell lingro, even though they know it's forbidden and they don't have that much gain over it. So now let me show you some of the most interesting comparisons that show significant differences between groups. When we asked if the main purpose of combe harvest was for selling, there were no significant differences between islands, but there was a significant difference between family sizes. So larger families tend to disagree more with this statement, suggesting that they harvest less for selling and more for feeding their large families, as opposed to the smaller families that harvest more often for selling. As for the lingro, we found differences between islands. So everybody in Bijag strongly disagreed with selling this bivalve, where in Formosa, interestingly, which is the island with more strict regulations based on traditional practices, here's where lingro was admittedly used for selling occasionally. And this is, as explained before, this is likely propelled by the economic interest of different ethnic groups that are arriving now to this island. As for the historical perception of harvest, when we asked them to compare the current year with the past year for both combe and lingro harvesting, there were significant differences between islands. So people from Bijag, they strongly agreed that it is now harder to collect combe and lingro this year, whereas people from Formosa mostly disagree with this, claiming it is now easier to collect. So this suggests that there is a variation on fisheries intensity and stock reposition between islands in the short term. Now, when we ask them if it is harder to collect the bivalves now compared to 10 years ago, the patterns are exactly the same. In Bijag, they agree it is harder, and in Formosa, they disagree, saying it is now easier to collect. The fact is that in Formosa, around about 10 years ago, there was an overexploitation of these bivalves, leading to decreased densities, which included even local extinctions of lingron in some areas. And with this extinction, there was a loss of cultural knowledge of the younger generations, as the typical ceremonies of passage were not performed. So after this period, they implemented local conservation strategies, such as the prohibition of selling, to ensure there was a sustainable use of this resource over time. In Bijag, on the other hand, the current difficulty in harvesting seems to indicate that people's higher economical responsibility is leading them to an overexploitation of their benthic resources, which is also happening on other natural resources, such as the palm trees, agriculture, and logging. So this shows a bit of the vulnerability of these resources, that if left unmanaged can rapidly lean towards local extinctions, but if well managed can bounce back from it and be used sustainably for long periods without crashes in the populations. So to sum up, shellfishing is an important source of food. It is tightly linked to cultural practices with impact in societal organization, and it is also an important income for the Bijagos people. Direct competition with shorebirds appears to be very limited, with traditional rules promoting reduced overlap in mudflat presence, particularly during one of the critical stages, which is the fueling for spring migration. Local management actions seem to be effective in sustaining shellfish stocks, particularly in the protected area of Formosa. And by preserving the Bijagos cultural values, this benefits local biodiversity and in particular benthic resources such as the bivalves and consequently shorebirds. So the Bijagos people are a prime example of an effective traditional conservation system that is currently threatened by the materialistic allures of globalization and that needs to be valued within and outside their community as a first step to preserve it. I would like to thank everyone involved in this project, but especially our partner institutions, without whom these and other studies would not have been possible. And of course, I would like to thank you for listening to this talk. And if you have any questions, I would be happy to answer them in either the Q&R section or by email later. So thank you so much.